Ms. Richards.
Sir. Mr. Waters. I'm sorry, I can't see or hear Mr. Waters at the moment.
I'm here.
Oh, great. Thank you. You disappeared off my screen, Mr. Waters. Just still on the topic of the medical advisory panel for a few more questions, Mr. Waters. Do you recall in the course of the 1980s any occasions in which the Society sought medical advice from clinicians who were not members of the medical advisory panel?
I don't have any independent recollection of anything like that.
Okay. And do you know whether written records of advice given by the panel were routinely kept?
Minutes were kept of all MAP meetings.
I'm not sure whether we've seen much by way of minutes of MAP meetings. In the 80s, you'd have expected such meetings as took place at the panel to have been minuted, would you?
I would, yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, we can perhaps make further investigations in that regard. And then, did you have a sense again, I'm concentrating here on the 1980s, Mr. Waters, of whether other members of the panel felt able to disagree with Professor Bloom, or whether his decision-making was the major influence on the medical advisory panel?
I mean, as I recall meetings of the medical advisory panel, and as I learned from meetings of the Haemophilia Centre Directors Organisation, there appeared to be very little disagreement with Professor Bloom's line.
In terms of the meetings of the UKHCDO, you attended them, I think, in the course of the 1980s.
Well, I would have attended the one a year, I think.
Yes. Sorry, yes.
Yeah.
What was? Did you receive any impression as to the way in which the UKHCDO was structured and how it operated?
Very little. And of course, we never received the minutes of their meetings, to the best of my recall.
Prior to the steps that you took in 1991 to introduce terms of reference and a greater degree of structure to the medical advisory panel, had any earlier steps been taken to address the kind of concerns that you're identifying?
No formal steps, to the best of my recall.
Okay. And can you assist us with why that was, why this issue was not tackled earlier?
I think there were too many other pressing matters, really.
Would you agree with this, Mr. Waters, that by taking advice only from the senior members of UKHCDO, was the Society effectively disabling itself from scrutinising the treatment policies and recommendations that were being made by UKHCDO?
So, with the benefit of hindsight, I would certainly agree with that.
And you've made reference in your statement to an awareness that younger haematologists might have had a different approach.
Indeed, yeah.
Again, with hindsight, do you think that the Society should have, really from the outset, have looked to have a more balanced membership of the medical advisory panel, precisely so it could hear disagreement and dissent?
I do indeed, and that takes me back to my thoughts about the executive committee being made up of people who attended the big centres. Therefore, only the big boys got in on the act, really. Whereas there were rising stars like the then very young Dr. Mark Winter, for instance, who had views that weren't always surfaced.
And would it be fair to say that the Society was too trusting of the advice that it was given by members of the medical advisory panel, in your view?
Certainly, with the benefit of hindsight, that is the case.
I wanted to ask you about something you said in a letter, at least I think it's from you. It's HSOC 0011023. Yes, it's a letter from you to Dr. Ludlam in 1988. So we can see that you were writing to Dr. Ludlam on the 8th of August 1988. The context was an invitation to him to attend a meeting of the Medical Advisory Panel. And you talk in the second main paragraph about the Executive Committee wanting the Medical Advisory Panel to play effectively a bigger role in the life of the Society. And then halfway through the paragraph you say this: I think it is essential that the MAP be consulted on, for instance, treatment and blood products, especially since it is in everyone's interest that we should all say the same thing. What did you mean by that, Mr. Waters?
I think that there was a danger of differing advice from the Society and the Medical Advisory Panel. I can't recall specifically what might have been in my mind on the 8th of August 1988.
Because what you've just said to us in your earlier answers was you think it would have been healthy for the Society to have a range of different opinions being conveyed to it.
Yes, I do think that would be the case, but at the end of the day, we would be striving to reach a consensus view.
Okay.
Having listened to all views.
And then in your statement, you've referred to that you've said this: if the Society was repeatedly phoned by members asking similar questions, so if there was a particular topic of concern amongst members, you would seek permission to discuss those issues with the Medical Advisory Panel. Can you recall whether the risk of infection from blood products was a common topic raised in questions by members?
Sorry, I lost track in the middle of your question.
Yes. So, was the risk of infection from blood products a topic that was commonly raised by phone or letter by individual members with you?
At what stage?
At the moment, if we talk about pre-AIDS.
It was not a common topic pre-AIDS.
Did it then become one as the 80s continued?
Oh, but of course.
We can take the document down. Thank you, Shumik. You've observed also in your statement that there was no direct link between the Medical Advisory Panel and the Blood Products Subcommittee. Do you think that there should have been a link?
Well, I suppose the link was Ken Milne, who would normally attend meetings of the Medical Advisory Panel if his other work arrangements allowed him to. But there was nothing formalised in there that said he would. And that's the difference between practice and policy.
Now, I want to come on to ask you about the Society's position and policy in relation to blood products in the early part of the 1980s. So this is still pre-AIDS. When you joined the Society in 1981, were you aware, or did you become aware, that the Society had voiced concerns over a number of years about insufficient supplies of concentrates?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
I want to ask you about a couple of documents. The first is HSOC 0022906. This is a bulletin from 1981, so it's around the time that you're joining the Society. And if we look in the left-hand column, bottom half of the page, we can see, and this is taken from, I think, the annual report, another central concern of the Executive has been the issue of blood products, A blood products subcommittee has been formed to look into this subject and promises to be a very valuable addition to the executive. Towards the end of the year, increasing concern was felt at the unsatisfactory situation regarding supply of Factor VIII concentrate. The main causes for concern were 1, the possibility of BPL, where most of Britain's concentrate is produced, being placed under commercial management. 2, inadequate supplies of concentrate to meet present and future demand. 3, increasing reliance on imported commercial material. Contrary to World Health Organization policy, the country should be self-sufficient in blood products, and with the possibility of greater risk of hepatitis infection. And then it continues, although the DHSS has decided not to involve commercial organisations in managing the BPL, the other problems are not yet resolved, although the DHSS has agreed to embark on the first stage of an expansion programme at the BPL. It is intended to monitor the situation much, and if we go to the top of the next column, more closely than in the past, and a new subcommittee of the Executive Committee has been set up to do this in cooperation with the Haemophilia Centre directors, and to assist in pressing the DHSS to provide adequate supplies of Factor VIII. Now, is that an accurate summary of the Society's concerns and policy in relation to the issue of factor concentrates and supply at the time you joined the Society?
Yes, I would say it was, in as far as I remember things terribly clearly from 40 years ago.
And we can see the reference at that top of the second column to the subcommittee, that's the blood products subcommittee, having been set up to monitor the situation in cooperation with the Haemophilia Centre directors. Now that might suggest there was some kind of direct link between the Haemophilia Centre directors, or UKHCDO, and the blood products subcommittee. Do you know of any formal link, or was it essentially Mr. Milne's role in the way you've described?
It was essentially Mr. Milne's role in the way I've described. And I think that could have been put more accurately.
And then if we go to one other document, this is from just before you arrived, Mr. Waters. Shomik, it's HSOC 0019919_022, please. These are minutes of the Executive Committee on the 9th of December 1980, so a couple of months before you took up your post. If we go to the second page, please. And we look at the first half of the page, the long paragraph beginning Mr. Prothero reported. If we go about 10 or so lines down, it says, Mr. Prothero reported on a new machine that had been developed by Travanol at a cost of $1 million. This would enable an increase in the production of Factor VIII concentrate to be made with improved quality. Mr. Prothero and Mr. Poulton had lunch with some of the chief personnel of Travanol Europe. Travanol is the largest supplier of plastic bags and equipment generally to the BTS. And then it says this, Mr. Tanner said that present developments makes it necessary for the Society to make some policy decisions in relation to commercial products. And then there is, Mr. Poulton stresses the need to keep in close contact with Travanol, pointing out that one of the directors was on a DHSS committee on blood products. Well, can you assist with this, Mr. Waters? The reference to Mr. Tanner saying necessary for the Society to make some policy decisions in relation to commercial products. Do you know what that might refer to?
I wouldn't know what was in Mr. Tanner's mind when he said that. I can, however, surmise he was talking about commercial products as opposed to British products.
But in terms of having to make policy decisions, you don't know specifically what that refers to?
No.
If we then turn to your first, or what I think was probably your first Executive Committee meeting, possibly your second, it's HSOC 00109919_026. So I've given you the wrong URN there, Seamus, my apologies. I've added a 0. HSOC 00199919_026. So if we look at the top of the page, we can see it's the minutes of a meeting of the Executive Committee on the 5th of March 1981, and those present include you. So this would either have been your first or second Executive Committee meeting. If we go down to the bottom of the page, we can see there under the heading Blood Products Subcommittee, there's a report from, I think, Mr. Milne and Mr. Prothero. But before we look at the detail of it, was the Blood Products Subcommittee minuted? Because I don't think we've seen minutes as such. We see reports to the Executive Committee.
My recall would have been that they should have been minuted. Whether they just took notes and reported to the Executive doesn't come back to my mind at this time.
Then I just want to get a sense of whether this is a sort of typical Executive Committee meeting. So we've got a report from the Blood Products Subcommittee and a reference to the committee gathering information and statistics for a meeting with the Minister. And then if we go over the page, the very top of the page, there's a reference to your new role and your job title of coordinator. We can then see a group seminar. There's a report on the group seminar and interest in the process and issue explored about seeking funding from pharmaceutical companies. And then we can see there's the Group Liaison Officer's report at point 6 towards the bottom half of the page. Was there someone then whose role it was to liaise with the local groups and report back to the Executive Committee?
That was Dr. Kuttner's role, but I noticed that he ceased that function at a certain stage, and it clearly ended up on my desk as well.
Okay. And then if we go to the next page, we can see there's a Treasurer's report, and then there's the Honorary Secretary's report. That's about grants. And then we can see European Liaison Officer's report and WFH matters. And then there's a discussion about how to facilitate attendance at the World Federation of Haemophilia Conference in Costa Rica. So there was, it sounds from the title European Liaison Officer as though there was somebody, a member of the Executive Committee, whose function it was to liaise with haemophilia societies in other European nations. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So is this a fairly typical Executive Committee process? There are reports made by subcommittees
Yes.
And members with particular responsibilities to the Executive Committee for them to reach decisions.
Yes, yes.
And you've helped us with an understanding of the way in which you believe the Medical Advisory Panel operated. In terms of the Executive Committee, when there were matters that had to be decided as opposed to just noting reports, to what extent was there disagreement? Were people able on the Executive Committee freely to speak their mind and disagree with what was being suggested?
Oh, yes. In fact, very soon after my appointment, we had two members of the Executive Committee resign dramatically in a meeting in opposition to the establishment of my post. It was quite dramatic. I can recall chairs being overturned and all sorts.
Now, when you took up your post in 1981, had you seen or been told of the 1975 World in Action documentary, which looked at issues of risk associated with sourcing plasma for factor concentrates in the States?
I wasn't aware of it when I went into the post, but I soon became aware of it.
And how did the Haemophilia Society, again in this talking here 1981, 1982, how did it keep abreast of developing knowledge about risks? How did it monitor the safety of concentrates?
Well, as we've already established, the Society was a very small and vulnerable organisation, and we had to rely on all sorts of people for information and advice, medical journals if we happen to have time to read them, friendly doctors who may tell us things, but I'm afraid we didn't have the resources to be monitoring everything and every bit of news media.
We can see quite a few references in executive committee meetings of reports from the blood products subcommittee of meetings with pharmaceutical companies. So is it fair to say that pharmaceutical companies were one source of the information that the executive committee had available to it through the mechanism of the blood products subcommittee?
That would have been one source, but only one source, yeah.
I'm just trying to...
I mean, we also had particularly close relationships with people like Andy Veach, who was the medical correspondent of The Guardian at that time, who was always very helpful and interested in our cause, as well as close links with the Sunday Times, who carried many articles on the compensation issues. And they were very good at keeping us informed as well. So we were never relying on one source of information. Would that we had been able to afford a full-time research officer who could have kept an eye on all those things, but I say that with the benefit of hindsight, of course.
So I just want to get a sense of what the sources of information would have been. You've identified the possibility of journalistic information being provided to the Society, pharmaceutical companies. You've described already the regular meetings with civil servants at the DHSS. We've obviously got the Medical Advisory Panel and UK HCDO, which we've discussed. Would that cover the principal sources of information that the Society would have had at that time to enable it to reach an informed view about risks?
Did you mention HCDO in that list?
Yes.
Yes. That would be it. Of course, we always had to filter that information because all those parties, especially Department of Health, HCDO and things, they only told us what they wanted us to know. And that was why it was so important to have the journalistic input as well.
And you would add there, would you, the Lancet and the BMJ, if you had
Indeed.
time?
If we had time to read it, yes.
Can you recall, again, when you started in 1981 and over the next couple of years, do you recall whether the risk of hepatitis was something that was prominent in the Society's thinking?
Oh, yes. And I mean, all that featured in the Society's overarching concern that the UK should become self-sufficient in blood products following the promise of Dr. David Owen in 1974, 5, yeah.
Can you recall anything about what the Society's understanding was, or your understanding was, of this in relation to non-A, non-B hepatitis in the early 1980s?
Could you be more specific about the question?
Absolutely, Mr. Waters. Did you or your colleagues, as far as you can recall, understand non-A, non-B hepatitis, what we now know as hepatitis C, to be a mild, benign condition or a serious condition?
That was what we were told at the time. And I guess that was possibly based on the knowledge at the time, which we see reflected very clearly in the present COVID-19 instance where, hopefully not in 40 years' time, there'll be another public inquiry into what went wrong there.
When you say that was what we were told at the time.
You were given two alternatives there, either mild or serious.
Yeah, mild.
That's what I think you were trying to say, but just for the sake of the record.
Yes. Indeed, many years later, when I went to work for another organisation, the Primary Immunodeficiency Association, there was an outbreak of hepatitis C because it had then been classified. And again, we were told it was a very mild condition. It was a benign condition that wouldn't affect too many people too badly. I have to add that that infection was due to a breakdown in manufacturing process in the United States created by CDC or someone like that, which was very quickly put right.
You've told us that you don't think that the Society received copies of minutes of UK HCDO meetings. Did the Society receive copies of anything produced by the UK HCDO's Hepatitis Working Party? Any of its reports or studies?
I think not. I don't recall.
And do you recall in the course of perhaps the first half of the 80s or indeed later into the 80s, whether the Society had any particular policies or concerns about storage of blood samples from haemophilia patients?
We did indeed, because it came to our attention that those stored samples were being tested retrospectively and without consent from the patients whose samples they were.
So is this right? That wasn't something that you were aware of in the first half of the 1980s. It came to light through the process of testing people for HIV.
Correct.
Now, I want to look at just some details of ministerial meetings in 1981, 1982. If we go first of all to HSOC 0020339, please. So we can see here a document headed Briefing Paper for Meeting with Dr. Gerard Vaughan, 21st of October 1981. Attached to this brief outline is the updated paper which has been discussed in the Blood Products Subcommittee. I'm afraid we don't have to hand the updated paper, but we've got the outline. Supply of Factor VIII, and then there's reference to Dr. David Owen's statement about self-sufficiency. And then this document says this expectation has not been realised, and estimates for total requirement of Factor VIII have now doubled to 100 million units. Our prime question is self-sufficiency still departmental policy? And then if yes, there are a series of questions there set out about how it's going to be achieved. And then we can just see from the second page that the second topic for the ministerial meeting relates to prescription charges. So I'm just going to show you that and then show you a document, Mr. Waters, relating to the meeting itself. So if we could then go to DHSC 0002211_062. And if we go to the second page, we look at the top half of the page, we can see it's note of a meeting between MSH, that's the Minister of State for Health, and representatives of the Haemophilia Society on Wednesday the 21st of October 1981. Present Minister of State for Health, Mr. Godfrey. And then from the Haemophilia Society, 5 people present, including you, Mr. Waters. And then supply of Factor VIII, The Haemophilia Society's representatives were concerned that the NHS was so reliant upon expensive imported blood products and feared that cuts in NHS expenditure might result in health authorities refusing to supply factor VIII to haemophiliacs. MSH assured the Society of the government's support for the principle of self-sufficiency in blood products, though he stressed that this had to be a long-term aim, as the present blood products laboratory at Elstree was not able to manufacture sufficient factor VIII to obviate the need to import blood products. MSH reported that the laboratory's current upgrading programme would double factor VIII production to 30 million international units by the end of 1982. Planning of the new laboratory had begun. It was too early at this stage to say what its capacity would be or when it would be fully commissioned. And then 2, the Haemophilia Society accepted that self-sufficiency should only be aimed for if it could be shown to be economic to do so. Can I ask you, first of all, Mr. Waters, what recollection you have of this meeting? Because I think you've talked about certainly a meeting with Dr. Vaughan in your statement, and I think it may have been this one.
I remember the meeting very well because we were totally taken by surprise. We were received by Gerard Vaughan in a very warm way, not the way that ministers would always meet a group of patient representatives. And we were assured that the door we had come to push on, we must not push too hard because it was already open and steps were well advanced to make sure that the United Kingdom became self-sufficient in blood products. And all this came before we had really said why we wanted to come and what we wanted to talk about. And we went away thinking, hey, what does this guy know that we don't know? What's triggered this sudden change of approach? But yes, this was the meeting.
So you understood there to be, in this meeting, we saw from the briefing paper you'd intended to ask the question, is it still the government's policy that there should be self-sufficiency? And is this right, that the Minister was saying that that was, the government did support that objective?
Yes, yes.
And then there's a reference here to there being an upgrading programme of BPL. Do you know whether that was something the Society knew about before the meeting, or was that information it gained during the meeting?
Can't recall.
Now, this is obviously only a note, not detailed minutes or a detailed account of the meeting, but there's obviously concern being expressed about problems with supply of factor VIII for haemophiliacs. There's no express reference here to issues about risks of infection or hepatitis. Do you recall whether that was discussed in the meeting with the Minister at all?
It was discussed in the meeting, and as for point 2 of the note of the meeting, I certainly have no recollection whatsoever of the Haemophilia Society ever accepting that self-sufficiency should only be aimed for if it could be shown to be economic to do so. Our interest was never based on economics. It was based entirely on the health of people with haemophilia. So, and you possibly saw me smile when the slide came up. I wondered if it was the same meeting for quite some time, but I'm now satisfied it was.
Okay, well, you've anticipated what my next question was going to be, which was about point 2. So just going back to my earlier question, you recall risks of hepatitis were discussed in the meeting, you think?
They would have been discussed, yes.
And then we can see the letter, so the point 4 on this note records the Society asking if the Minister would write confirming plans to increase the supply of factor VIII produced by BPL. And then we can see the letter that was written by the Minister at RLIT 301226. We can see it's a letter of the 30th of October 1981 from Dr. Gerard Vaughan. And if we look at the second paragraph, He says, I appreciate the Society's concern about the extent to which the NHS relies upon commercial blood products. As I told you, the upgrading programme being carried out at BPL will at present yields enable the laboratory to double its output of factor 8 by the end of 1982. While this will not eliminate the need for commercial products, it represents a major step forward in NHS production of this vital material. And then he adds this, I also said we plan to replace the existing BPL within the next few years, and he goes on to talk about that in fairly general terms, and then says this, although I endorse the principle of self-sufficiency in blood products, it is only realistic to recognise that demand for factor 8 is constantly increasing and that self-sufficiency is not a goal we can achieve in the immediate future. And then he talks about the work of the Society and suggests it may be useful to meet again. Does that accurately reflect your recollection of what the Minister said at the meeting?
I think there was much greater emphasis at the meeting on actually achieving self-sufficiency than is implied either in the note or in that letter. I think the civil service may have tweaked the Minister's enthusiasms before committing it to paper.
So is this right? Your impression of the meeting was that there was a more enthusiastic or unqualified support for achieving self-sufficiency than one sees reflected in the written materials?
Yeah. And of course, at that time, we were not particularly aware of HIV, I don't think, but the Department of Health clearly were. And I think that shock had given them a little kick in the pants, as it were.
Yes, the way you put it in your statement, and it's right to say that you had another meeting, I think, in 1982, and we'll look at that in a moment. But you say that your sense was that the department had reached a decision to put their foot on the accelerator. Yeah. And that was because you. This is what you say in your statement, you thought that the department may have had some sense that there was going to be a potential for a major crisis with blood products.
Of course, that only became clear with hindsight. But
the 1982 meeting with Mr. Vaughan, we can see reflected in some executive committee minutes. So if we go to HSOC 00294760_015. If we look at the top part of the page to start with, we can see it's meeting of the Executive Committee on the 9th of September of 1982. And then if we go to the second page, please, Shomik. And we look at the top of the second page. We can see Mr. Milne reported that he and the coordinator, so that's you and Mr. Milne, met with representatives of the DHSS on Tuesday, the 7th of September, and they discussed the development of the blood products laboratory at Elstree, prescription charges, mobility allowance, and possible DHSS funding. And then it says this, in discussion, the Executive Committee accepted it would be unwise for the time being to pursue further the question of prescription charge exemption. And then there's a reference to mobility allowance and possible funding. So it would appear that's, that meeting may be more of just an update on the work, because there's no major revelation set out in this account.
No.
And do you have any independent recollection of this further meeting with Dr. Gerald Vaughan, or with whoever the minister
None
was?
at all. I don't even know that it was with Dr. Gerard Vaughan. It says representatives of the DHSS, which could imply it was civil servants that we met with.
Yes, the heading is meeting with the minister, but you're right, it then says representatives of the DHSS. You can't recall which it was?
No.
Do you know, we can take that down, thank you. Do you know, Mr. Waters, whether the Society or the Blood Products Committee, either prior to your arrival or in the course of the first half of the 80s, made any attempts to influence government decision-making on the licensing of blood products?
I have no recall.
And then in your statement...
If you had a document, it may prompt me.
No. It was a general question, Mr. Waters. No specific document. You then, in your statement, when you talk about self-sufficiency in your statement, you've said this. Perhaps we'll put it up on screen for the benefit of those watching. It's WITN 3429001. And if we go to page 68, please. Sorry, 68, Shobik. So 4 pages on. In paragraph 148, you say this: you were asked about whether the Society had received assurances about self-sufficiency. You've referred to Dr. Owen's assurance, and then you talk about the meeting with Dr. Gerard Vaughan, and you've given us your account of that. And then you say this: that was a complete turnaround by any government since Dr. David Owen left his post as Secretary of State for Health. After Dr. David Owen had left his post, the government had essentially gone back on what had been pledged. I think people stopped just short of saying, no, we're not going to go for self-sufficiency. I think it's simply dropped way down the priority list. Can I just ask you, what's the basis for your feeling, your sense that what you were being told by Dr. Vaughan was a turnaround from the position since Dr. Owen had left his post? Was that the reaction of your colleagues who'd been there for longer, or something else?
Oh yes. And I mean, first of all, we got this sudden invitation out of the blue to go and meet Gerard Vaughan. That's not the way it normally works. You've normally got to beg for a meeting with a minister. And then for this sudden dramatic announcement that new money had been found to invest in BPL, and that there were plans to build a new plant and everything else, was just completely out of the blue. They had always said in the past that it made economic sense to use imported blood products from the United States, and the benefits far outweighed the disadvantages, and so on and so forth.
So is this right? In 81, 82, the Society's sense had been that the goal of self-sufficiency had effectively been abandoned, and it was hence the briefing paper we saw where that question was going to be posed of the minister. And so that's part of the reason for the surprise reaction of those attending this meeting.
Indeed, yes.
Can you recall, and we can take that down, thank you. Can you recall the extent to which within the Society, again, prior to AIDS coming on the scene, so really we're talking here 81, 82, or 81 and the first half of 82, can you recall the extent to which within the Society there were discussions about dangers associated with large pool sizes of donations?
Yes, I can remember the discussions, but I can't remember the details.
And were there discussions about the relative safety of NHS versus commercial concentrates?
Yes, and NHS concentrates were seen as pure as the driven snow, really.
And can you recall in the first half of the 80s whether there were any discussions within the society about sources of blood donations in the UK, in particular collection of blood from prisoners or military donors? Was that something the society talked about?
Not a lot, but it was there in discussions. And was seen as undesirable. The volunteer donor being the basis of safety.
So there was some awareness, is this the right way of putting it? There's some awareness within the society that in the United Kingdom there were blood collections from prisoners and from military donors?
Yes, yes.
And do you know whether that's something the society ever made representations about to the blood transfusion service or to the DHSS?
I've got no recollection of that at all. It may well have been made even before I arrived on scene.
Now, in terms of how the society then disseminated information to its members about, in particular, the risks associated with treatment, would the bulletin have been the main way in which the society communicated its understanding of risks to its members? Indeed,
yes, yes.
So there's the bulletin, there are the roughly annual group seminar proceedings. This will come on to Haemophilia in due course.
And I think we also had a residential conference in quite a few years, but that may have been later.
So is it fair to say that if we as an inquiry are looking to see what the society was saying to its members about non-A, non-B hepatitis, the bulletin is probably the best source?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I can't recommend it as a thoroughly reliable source, but it would be the source of any information that was there.
Yes, it will tell us what, as a matter of fact, was being said, even if it wasn't correct. And we'll just look at one example then of that. It's BART 0002327 _001. So we can see this is the bulletin. Not sure where, I can't quite see the date on this at the moment. I think it's pretty sure it's 1982. And
we weren't good at dating publications.
No, I think that's undoubtedly true. We can see the chairman's writing, and he wishes all good wishes for 1982, which is how I'm giving it that date. If we go to page 6, please.
It does say 1982 at the top.
Oh, it does, yes.
Yes,
one
it
of
does.
1982.
Thank you, sir. On my black and white photocopy, it doesn't come out at all, but yes, we can see that. Thank you.
It's pretty faint on ours, but you can just see it.
Yes. So we can see, if we look at, this is an article on page 6 of it. If we zoom in on the right-hand column, please, Shomik, the article that begins, jaundice cases show unexplained increase. And there's a reference there to Andrew Veitch, and then we can see at the bottom of his article it says, with grateful acknowledgement to the editor of The Guardian, 5th of August 1981. So do I correctly understand this is effectively the reproduction in the bulletin of an article published by one of the journalists you mentioned in The Guardian?
Indeed, yes.
And we can see Mr. Veitch saying this. Figures released yesterday show that the number of cases of infective jaundice in England and Wales rose by 60% to more than 5,000 last year, and the 5 to 14-year-olds suffered most. The illness is commonly caused by one of the hepatitis viruses, and then there's a reference to hepatitis A, but and this is on the decline. Dame Sheila Sherlock at the Royal Free is recorded as saying it's out of keeping with trends all over the world. And then it says the rate of jaundice among children has been falling for years, but last year it shot up. And then it says this: one possible culprit is a third virus, simply called hepatitis non-A, non-B, because it is neither one nor the other. This is known to be spreading in the States, and there is speculation that it may have arrived here. Now, currently, as far as we can assess, this is the first reference to non-A, non-B hepatitis in the Society's bulletins, although I've no doubt that we'll be corrected if we're wrong in relation to that. Does it surprise you that as at 1982, that all that's being said about non-A, non-B hepatitis is that there's speculation it may have arrived here?
No, none at all.
Is it fair to say non-A, non-B hepatitis was not something that was foremost in the Society's mind at this time?
In 1981, possibly not.
And is that in part because of the understanding you referred to earlier that it was just a mild condition and not something to be worried about?
Mild condition, yes.
So, is it fair to say that if members of the Society were relying upon the Society for information about non-A, non-B hepatitis, there's relatively little information they'd have received from the Society by the early 80s?
As I understand it, there was very little information to be had anyway. But yes, what you say is correct.
You've said more generally in your statement about the Society's publications that they were never intended to replace the medical advice that patients were entitled to receive from their clinicians. Is that correct?
We said that particularly on Haemophilia.
But it is right to notice that the bulletin would contain articles written by clinicians.
Yes.
And what was done with the bulletin? Was it sent by post to the Society's members?
Oh my goodness me! You bring back horrid memories of an old addressograph machine. The cards had to be soaked in water and people's addresses typed in. Then they had to be dried. And then they were put in cartridges. And 9 times out of 10, half of them ended up flying all over the room. And you had to check very carefully to make sure that all the envelopes had been printed. But yes, the bulletins were delivered to the office. We addressed envelopes and stuffed them and mailed them, putting a postage stamp of the right value on each one, because we didn't even have a franking machine in those days.
Now, the bulletin had its own editor, but he wasn't, as I understand it, someone with any medical qualifications himself.
Oh, no. A member of the trustees, a patient.
Was there any process of verification of what was being said in articles in the bulletin ever undertaken, or was it just a clinician had been asked or had volunteered an article and it would be printed with no further consideration?
If there was any doubt, it would have been referred to the chairman of the Haemophilia Centre Directors Organisation for an opinion. I can't recall whether that ever happened or not.
Bulletins, we've discussed. Haemophilia will come on to. Group seminar proceedings. What happened with the group seminar proceedings publications? Were they sent to every member or only those who attended the seminar?
No, to every member.
Executive committee or council minutes, were those for internal purposes only? They weren't sent to members?
I think council members got executive committee minutes. And executive and council got their minutes, and it was really up to councils what they did with the minutes when they got them. They were open to share them with their committee or their membership or whatever. Yeah.
So those on the council who were the representatives of the local groups could share them with their local group members.
Yes.
but the Society itself did not provide copies of the Executive Committee or Council minutes to its members?
No. Anything significant would be reported in the bulletin itself. You know, like research grants awarded and things like that.
Now, I want to come on then, before we break for lunch, to 1983 and your involvement and the Society's involvement in the developing AIDS crisis. I'm going to start in January 1983, and then we might look back beyond that, but we'll start in January 83. Shamit, could we have DHSC 302223_085? You'll see, Mr. Waters, and you can ignore the handwriting at the top, but you'll see this is a Observer article from Sunday the 16th of January 1983, Mystery Disease Threat, and it's authored by Christine Doyle in Washington. And then it says, I won't go through all of it, but a commercial blood product imported into Britain from the US may pose a grave threat to the health of haemophiliacs who inject it to encourage clotting. The product has transformed the lives of haemophiliacs. Now it's being linked in America with a devastating and mystifying disease. And then it goes on to explain more about AIDS. So that was the article on the 16th of January 1983. You then sent it to Professor Bloom and asked for further information. And I want to look at that with you, please. It's BPLL 0001351_071. So we can see on the 19th of January 1983, you wrote to Professor Bloom as follows. The Reverend Alan Tanner has asked that I write to you enclosing this article from the Observer of Sunday the 16th of January. We're writing to you in your capacity as Chairman of the Centre Directors Meeting and our own medical advisory panel to seek some clarification on current thinking in the UK on this matter, which has naturally raised some anxiety with calls coming from as far away as The Hague. It would be most helpful to us if you could offer guidance at this stage with the possibility of an early date article for the bulletin so we can keep our members in touch with the situation. Now, can you recall, first of all, Mr. Waters, what you knew or what you understand the Reverend Tanner to have known about an association between AIDS and haemophiliacs before this article was published?
Memories and dates with the passing of the years are naturally a little hazy. I would need to look at a chronology of events, really, and what the World Federation of Haemophilia was saying and what the National Haemophilia Foundation in the United States were saying. But my guess is that we knew things about the link between blood products and HIV at that time.
Well, your observation's a fair one, Mr. Waters. I won't produce yet further documents, but we know from July of 1982 reports emerging from the States of haemophiliacs believed to be suffering from AIDS. And we know that in September of 1982 at the UK HCGO meeting, it was raised as something that needed to be looked into further by Dr. Krask. So it had been, as it were, something flagged up over the preceding 6 months. Is it fair to say the Society you'd expect would have been aware of that?
We would have been aware of that, although, of course, we wouldn't have seen the minutes of UK HCDO necessarily, but word gets around.
No, and I'll have to check the minutes, but presumably someone from the Society would have, would normally have been there. Was it, as far as you can recall, Reverend Tanner's decision only to ask Professor Bloom and not the medical advisory panel more widely about this article, or was that your decision?
That would have been Father Tanner's decision, leaving it to Professor Bloom, if he wished to do so, to consult others on the UKHCDO.
And then I think we've got a reply from Professor Bloom, for which I have unfortunately got two references. And I'm not sure which is correct, Seamus. Let's try both of them. HCDO 603_066. Yes, so we have here Professor Bloom's response, dated the 20th of January 1983. Dear Mr. Waters, thank you very much for your letter. And this cutting does seem to have caused some concern amongst patients and indeed some medical administrators and physicians. There may be a modicum of justification for this concern. You are no doubt aware of the background that a rather serious new disease began to be recognised towards the end of 1981, particularly amongst homosexuals in the USA. And then a few lines further down, he says, however, later, as detailed in the Observer article, several groups of people who are clearly not homosexuals, including various immigrant groups in the USA, as well as the 10 haemophiliacs, were identified as suffering from the disease. Clearly, at the present time, the cause is quite unknown. Neither has it been proven that it's transmitted through contaminated blood products. The incidence of the condition in America is not known, but seems to be about 1 per 1,000 of the severely affected treated patients. On this basis, if the disease exists in the UK, we could reasonably expect 2 or 3 cases amongst British haemophiliacs. So far, none have been reported. And then he goes on to say in the next paragraph that the situation is being monitored by the UKHCDO. At the meeting of our hepatitis working party this week, the meeting referred to in the Observer, it was decided to institute a retrospective survey to all haemophilia centre directors and also a prospective survey in order to try to detect any possible emergence of the syndrome in the country. We do not know at the moment if the condition exists in lesser degrees of severity, but we shall clearly have to keep on the lookout for this. As the full-blown condition has not yet been reported amongst British haemophiliacs, it's not possible to state if the coagulation concentrations produced in this country are safer. We go over the next page. In this respect, than the concentrations produced in the USA. Indeed, there's no evidence yet, in fact, to implicate the latter. And then he talks about investigations of possible markers by directors of several centres. In the meanwhile, there is certainly no need for the haemophilic community to be unduly concerned about this new syndrome. They can rest assured that every effort is being made to monitor the situation in this country and to collaborate with the Centre for Disease Control. And then he talks about the position in relation to haemophilia B. And then he says, as you and your colleagues in the society know, coagulation factor therapy is so essential for the safety and well-being of patients that there's no doubt whatsoever that their advantages far outweigh this disadvantage, which at the moment seems to be potential rather than real in the UK at any rate. Further developments will depend upon identifying the responsible agent or constituent of concentrates if it exists, and no doubt then steps can be taken to attempt to eliminate them, much in the same way as steps are being taken to reduce the risk of hepatitis. And then there's a reference to the possibility of an article from Dr. Krask. Do you recall what the Society's response was or reaction was on receiving this letter from Professor Bloom? Was it reassuring?
I think at the time, based on what we knew, it was fairly reassuring. But it wasn't long after this, stop me if I'm going ahead of you, right, that I remember we were at a board meeting at the Kennedy Hotel by Euston Station, and Clive Knight and I had great trouble persuading the trustees, the executive committee of the Haemophilia Society, that this was in fact going to become a live problem in the United Kingdom. Things were being said like, oh, you know, we don't have bathhouses in the United Kingdom like they have in the United States. And we were saying, no, but we're certainly using the same blood product, you know. And it was quite difficult to persuade even a board made up of people with haemophilia that this was, in fact, going to be a real problem that had to be faced. And of course, with the benefit of hindsight, we know that we were possibly in this letter of Arthur Bloom, 20th of January, not being told the whole truth.
One of the reasons why, as I understand it, you say that with the benefit of hindsight, you don't think you were being told the real truth, is you have a recollection, Mr. Waters, of a BBC journalist showing you a letter.
Indeed.
Can you, we can take this down, Shamik. Can you just tell us what your recollection is of that?
It was in May 2017, long after I retired and was living here in Cornwall permanently, that the Panorama programme contacted me to come and film. After the filming was finished, they showed me a very heavily redacted letter that came from a branch of the Department of Health, possibly Public Health England as it's now called, in which Professor Bloom was told in no uncertain terms that there was going to be a problem with imported concentrates, but he, at all costs, should make sure that the advice was always given to patients that they should continue to take their blood products. As Professor Bloom said in that letter, we've just seen the risks far out, the benefits far outweigh the risks, because this was going to be a small problem.
You weren't, I think, given a copy of the letter by the BBC
I was
journalists.
shown it. I wish I had the presence of mind to take it to the next room and photocopy it, but I didn't. And the people on the programme took it away with them. And I think we've actually narrowed down the people involved in preparing that programme. And hopefully that letter should still be in the file of background research for the programme.
Yes, and I should say so that the inquiry is taking steps to see if you can obtain this material. Do you have any recollection of what year the letter was?
It was pre-1980, I think.
Pre-1980?
Around about 1980.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, no doubt if we manage to obtain a copy of it, Mr. Waters, we may ask you further in relation to that. Just sticking with early 1983, the inquiry has had evidence from others and seen a document which shows that there was a meeting of haemophilia centre directors and some other clinicians together with Immuno in January of 1983 at a London airport hotel, at which there was an update given of the current knowledge about AIDS, cases reported in a transfused baby in California, and various other matters discussed. Can you recall whether that came to the Society's attention at the time? Did you know anything of that?
No.
If we then look at, before we break for the morning, HSOC 0029476 _ 022, please. We can see these are the minutes of a meeting of the Executive Committee of the Haemophilia Society on the 3rd of March 1983. So we're now a month and a half or so on from your exchange of correspondence with Professor Bloom in the Observer article. In a sense, there's nothing in particular to show you in this, Mr. Waters. There's an absence of any reference in this document to any discussion about AIDS. Does it surprise you that by March 1983, the Society's Executive Committee was not discussing the risk of AIDS in its committee meeting?
It does. It does. I cannot remember the meeting at which Clive Knight and I intervened, as I described a few moments ago. But I would have thought it was around this time.
And your recollection is that that was at a meeting at the Kennedy Hotel, which I think there were quite a few meetings held at the Kennedy Hotel, so I don't know whether that'll assist us.
There were.
Did the Society ever get sent copies of the reports that were published in the States in a publication called the MMWR, which reported developments from CDC in Atlanta of new cases? Is that something the Society received at this time?
We didn't receive them regularly. We would occasionally receive them when the people in the NHF office in New York remembered that the United Kingdom wasn't in the United States and addressed it properly. But about 9/10 of the mail never arrived through wrong addressing.
And do you recall the Society becoming aware and any discussions taking place about the case of the baby that was reported in December '82 and certainly came to the attention of Professor Bloom and others, who had been transfused in the States and developed AIDS?
I have no recall of that.
So I note the time, and the next series of questions I have for Mr. Waters won't be completed within 5 minutes, so I wonder if we pick those up tomorrow morning.
Yes. And tomorrow morning is right, because we have the lunch break and we come back after lunch, do we not, to complete your presentation. But this is where Mr. Waters leaves us for the day. So thank you so far. What I said to you earlier about not speaking to anyone about the evidence, that continues over every break. So you won't do that. But I look forward to seeing you back here, same place, same time, tomorrow at 10 o'clock.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
And then
those who are watching remotely, be aware that we will be continuing with Ms. Richards' presentation to me, which did not conclude last week, and that will go on at 2 o'clock.
So in fact, I think it's 2:15 was the time we published. So we should probably stick to that.
2:15 in that case. That's the time.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.